Welcome to the Teacher Incentive Allotment's video webinar on setting expected growth targets. This presentation is targeted towards districts considering setting growth targets locally using the pre-test, post-test student growth measure. This session is designed to support districts so that you will be able to understand how to ensure an assessment is valid before planning to set expected growth. Understand requirements and best practices for setting expected growth targets, explain how various models for setting expected growth targets work, and determine the pros and cons of each method given your district context. This presentation is designed to encourage participants to stop and start the video to engage with the companion resource, Practice Setting Expected Growth Targets. If you have not already, you may want to take a moment to pause the video and have this resource ready for later in the presentation. This resource can be found in the same Google Drive folder as this presentation. In this section, we will cover the requirements and best practices for setting expected growth. This will include sample implementation timelines to support your district's planning. To support the clarity of the content in this presentation, we have some key terms to review and define briefly. BOY is also known as the beginning of the year test. Remember that the BOY test must be given within the first 6 to 9 weeks of the school year. EOY is known as the end of the year test, which is an assessment that is given during the last 12 weeks of the school year. Some of the models presented in this presentation will have terms like quartile or quintile. A quartile is simply a set of data divided into 4 parts or quarters. Similarly, a quintile is a set of data divided into 5 parts. These are the suggested milestones for setting expected growth targets in a given implementation year. In August, districts should communicate to teachers and school leaders the process they are using to set expected growth. This includes sharing the dates for test administrations, sharing the dates for when student results will be shared with teachers, and growth targets will be set. Also, reviewing assessments for validity and reliability should happen during this time. In September, districts will administer the pre-test within the first 9 weeks, or 6 weeks for those semester-long courses, and then determine expected growth targets for individual students for most of the models presented in this presentation. Throughout the school year, districts should be monitoring data collection. At the end of the year, the district will want to administer the post-test and then determine if students hit their expected growth targets. For the purposes of this presentation, we will examine setting those expected growth targets at the beginning of the year. A more detailed year at a glance is provided in the example TIA implementation calendar linked on this slide. All the requirements listed here are aligned to the TIA system application and the corresponding statutory requirements for student growth. These requirements are essential to ensure a fair and effective assessment of student progress. The first and foremost requirement is that the assessment used for setting these targets must be valid and reliable. This means that it is accurately measuring what it's supposed to measure and consistently yields the same results. When establishing these targets, we consider either the beginning of the year data or the end of the year data from the prior year. For instance, using STAR transition table from the 2023 Spring STAR administration to set growth targets for the 23-24 school year. The goal is to provide a clear starting point and a reference for growth expectations. Expected growth targets must be set within the first 9 weeks of the school year. For semester-long courses, this window is condensed to 6 weeks. Another crucial requirement is individualization. These targets are not one size fits all. They are tailored to the unique needs and abilities of each student. This approach recognizes that every student's journey is different. Finally, the targets we set are focused on growth rather than achievement. This means we're more interested in how much a student progresses during the school year rather than just whether they meet certain benchmarks. Some best practices districts should consider when setting expected growth targets include using multiple data points. This can lead to more reliable results. For instance, looking at both the student's reading and writing would be a good idea for an ELAR class, rather than just one of them. Leveraging EOY data from the prior spring is another best practice. The data serves as a valuable baseline for understanding where students stand at the start of the new academic year, especially for courses without prior year STAR administration, like 8th grade history or biology EOC. To gauge end of year growth, it is advisable to focus on the last 12 weeks of the school year. This time frame allows us to capture the most recent progress and align our targets with the most critical phase of the learning journey. Lastly, consider running your district's historical data through different models to see which one is most accurate. This advanced and data-driven approach ensures we're using the most precise and effective method for setting our targets. By using multiple data points, leveraging the prior year's EOY data, focusing on the last 12 weeks, and fine-tuning our models, we create a robust framework for setting accurate and meaningful expected growth targets. As part of your district's TIA system, you will have to outline clear procedures for how to set expected growth targets for each student. Remember, we are setting these growth targets at the individual student level so that they can be directly attributed to the teacher's impact on student learning as part of a TIA local designation system. The key takeaways are when setting expected growth targets, we create a path for our students to succeed and recognize their teacher's performance. Growth targets can be either third-party or district-created. This presentation is focusing only on the district-created growth targets. For more information on third-party growth targets like those offered by Renaissance Star or NWEA MAP, districts are encouraged to reach out to specific vendors to understand their offerings. One of the most frequently asked questions that we receive is which assessment should we use to measure student growth? Districts have wide flexibility in choosing the assessments they wish to implement as part of their TIA system. TIA recommends that districts start with valid and reliable tests that measure the content being taught and align to the standards of the course. Some very common tests that districts are using include NWEA MAP and STAR. The key question that we should be asked of any assessment, including district-created assessments, are as follows. Does the test assess the content and standards that the course is teaching? If the answer is yes, then the test could be used to measure growth. If no, the district should revisit the requirements for assessments aligned to the contents of the standards of the course. As your district considers where to acquire assessments to measure student growth, exercise caution with assessments that are advertised as covering grades K through 12. In some cases, these assessments often do not actually assess all content or standards for K through 12. Oftentimes, the vendors will say they cover K through 12, but you should carefully review the product, investigate to make sure they offer the specific assessments for the courses in which you are going to measure growth. While there is no specific percentage of alignment required for the use with TIA, it must align to the course standards. TIA encourages you to look at some assessments that have been vetted on our commonly used assessment list, which is linked at the bottom of this page. In this section, we will cover the 6 most common models for setting expected growth. Note that we recognize districts have varying context and staffing to support this work, and some examples may not directly apply to all districts. However, these examples are used in TIA districts across the state of Texas. There are 6 models we will review for districts to consider in setting expected growth targets. These are the graduated percent increase model, the common percent growth for all or flat rate model, the district average percent growth model, the gap closure model, the quartile quintile model, and other or different individualized methods. We will explore all of these throughout the course of this presentation. Let's begin with the graduated percent increase model. The graduated percent increase model is based on the quintile that the pretest score falls into. A different percent of expected growth is set for each quintile. With this model, when a student is placed into a lower quintile, they will be expected to show more growth as opposed to a student who starts the year in a higher quintile. If a student starts the year in the highest performing quintile, then they would be expected to maintain their position to show growth when end-of-year growth data is calculated. Let's review an example. Looking at this model, we are assigning percent points of expected growth to each quintile. Quintiles are divided by about 20 points. Looking at category 1, we can see that if a student scores between 0% and 20% on the pretest, they would be assigned 25% points of growth. The students would have to increase their score 25 percentage points on the post-test to show growth. For example, if a student scored 20% on the pretest, they would be required to make at least 45% on the post-test to show growth. Let's look at another example of how the graduated percent increase model can work. At this time, pause the video to review the table. Once reviewed, resume the video. Looking at Cristobal in category 3, he would be required to show at least 15 percentage points between the pretest and post-test. Since he scored a 55% on his pretest, his growth target would now be 70% on the post-test. We can see that since he scored a 75 on the post-test, he would have met his expected growth. Looking at Kate in category 5, she scored an 85% on the pretest, and she needed to maintain that score on the post-test to meet her expected growth. She scored an 84% on the assessment, thereby not meeting her expected growth target. Pause the video at this time and review the table. Once reviewed, press play to resume video. Another variation of the graduated percent increase model would be measuring the percent of growth. Using this variation requires that students be assigned percent increase with the lower quintiles needing to show a higher amount of growth than the higher quintiles. Cristobal scored 55% on the pretest, and his required growth is 40%. 40% of 55 is equal to 22% points. Thereby, Cristobal would need to score at least a 77% on his post-test to show that he has met growth. In other words, the lower the pretest score, the higher the percent growth is set. So for Camilla, whose post-test score is a 20%, 60% growth is expected, whereas for Cristobal, 40% growth is expected. Now that we understand how the graduated percent increase model works, let's look at some benefits and considerations when implementing the model to set expected growth. Pause the video at this time and read through the bullet points on this slide. Once you have read through the bullet points, push play to resume video. One benefit is that it allows districts to set those goals at the beginning of the school year, which can inform opportunities for focused interventions throughout the school year. However, one consideration when using this model is how the district will decide on the percentage of growth set for each category. How will they know this is the right amount of growth? Running the district's historical data through this model would be a best practice to understand how it fits to your district's local context. Let's review the common percent growth rate for all, or what is sometimes referred to as the flat rate model. Using the flat rate model, a district would set a percentage of growth that they want to see for all students. For example, a district may want to set an expected growth at 45% as a target for all students. This is accomplished by applying the flat rate to each student's beginning of the year score to determine their EOY target. This is a relatively simple model for setting expected growth. In this example, Tumbleweed ISD has set its expected growth rate at 50%. Akeem scored 30% on the beginning of the year exam. Adding 50 percentage points to his score would be required to show growth on the post-test. According to the table, he met growth with an 80% on the post-test. Conversely, Christina did not meet expected growth because her EOY score did not meet or exceed the expected growth target. What are the benefits and considerations when implementing common percent growth for all or the flat rate model to set expected growth? Pause the video and read through the bullet points on this slide. Once complete, resume the video. The biggest benefit is that most stakeholders, including students, will understand this model as it applies equally to everyone. One consideration for districts is, what's the best way to determine the flat rate the district will use? Districts do run the risk of setting this target too high or too low. It also would be a good idea to look at the historical data to ensure that the district has a precedent before setting a flat rate growth target. Now that we have considered a couple of models, let's do a thinking exercise. Complete the following portion of the worksheet called Practice, Setting Expected Growth Targets, located in the Google Drive folder for this presentation. Pause the video, review the activity, and restart the presentation when ready to continue. In this section, we will review the district average percent growth model. The district average percent growth model is very similar to the flat rate model, but uses the district's average to set growth targets. This method is commonly used by schools that are using third-party assessments, but wanting to set these growth targets at the local level. Let us look at a common scenario we see in respect to growth targets by exploring a district average percent growth model. Pause the video and read the description. Once you have finished reading the description, press play to continue. These growth targets align to how their students actually perform in their own district instead of aligning to national norms, which in their case led to inflated growth rates. With Tumbleweed ISD's average growth being about 40%, all students in the 4th grade would need to see that increase on the assessment to meet growth. Student A scored 40% on their beginning of the year assessment. Applying the district average growth model to this, the student would need to add 40% to his beginning of the year score. According to the table, student A was able to exceed their growth goal with a score of 92%. I do want to note that this target could be set at the end of the year based on post-test scores, or you could use historical data to set this at the beginning of the year. In this 2nd grade example from Tumbleweed Elementary, we can see that a 30% increase is expected for growth to be met for this class. Notice how Ronnie was able to exceed his growth goal with 90%, but Rita missed her growth goal by 4%. Districts will need to consider if this model may be the best fit for all of their students, and at times could lead to an expected growth score that is over 100%. Now that we understand how the district average percent growth model works, let's look at some benefits and considerations when implementing the district average percent growth model to set expected growth. Pause the video and read through the bullet points on this slide. Once complete, resume the video. One benefit of using the district average percent growth model is that it can correct for cases when the third-party vendor growth targets are too high or too low. This is the most common reason that districts use this model. Oftentimes, the vendor growth targets may not represent a district's local context. Districts may choose to use this model to avoid over or under designating teachers. One consideration in setting expected growth targets as average for the district may or may not be the best fit for all students. Would setting an average target show growth for your highest and lowest achieving students? This would be a local decision, but districts do need to consider it. In this section, we will review the gap closure model. In the gap closure model, a student's pretest score is compared to a perfect score. The difference between the pretest score and the perfect score is divided by 2 to ascertain the growth target for the post-test. So for instance, if Johnny scores a 50% on the pretest at the beginning of the school year, the gap between that and a perfect score would be an additional 50 points. That 50 points would then be divided by 2 to set the growth target at a 25-point gain, or a 75% on the post-test. This is commonly referred to as the half the gap method, but you could do this with any number. You could divide by 1/3 or 1/4. It would be a local decision. In this example, third grade student Yasmin takes a math test where the perfect score would be 100%. Yasmin scored 50% on the pretest, meaning she's 50 points away from a 100. We would then half that gap of 50%, meaning 25% increase on the post-test would be the growth goal for Yasmin. For Yasmin to meet her growth goal on the post-test, she would need to score a 75%. Pause the video and review the table. Once complete, resume the video. Looking at the half the gap method, we can see that Ryan scored a 62 on the pretest, leaving a gap of 38 between his pretest score and a perfect score. That 38 is then halved or divided by 2 to get 19. Ryan would need to score at least an 81 on his post-test to meet growth. Ryan scored an 82 on the post-test, exceeding his growth target. Another way to do the gap closure model is to divide by 3 or 4, which would be a district's local decision. In this example, Tanvir scored a 40 on the pretest. The gap between his pretest score and a perfect score is 60. 60 divided by 3 is 20. So he would need to show 20 points of growth between the two assessments and score at least a 60% on the post-test to show growth. Although he was close, Tanvir did not meet his growth target as he scored a 58. What are the benefits and considerations when implementing the gap closure model to set expected growth? Pause the video and read through the bullet points on this slide. Once complete, resume video. The gap closure model is strongest when there are gaps in performance between student groups by allowing both the highest and lowest achieving students to show growth. It's also an easy to understand bar for students to meet and show growth in a scaled way. Districts should consider that it can be complex for some stakeholders to understand, depending on the numbers that the district uses to close the gap. Another consideration is that students who score 100% on the pretest will not be able to show growth using this method. Perhaps they would need to maintain a 100% average. This would be a local decision. Now that we've considered the gap closure model to set expected growth, let's do a thinking exercise. Complete the gap closure portion of the worksheet. Practice setting expected growth targets located in the Google Drive folder. Pause the video, review the activity, ascertain if students met growth or not based on the data in the table, and restart the presentation when ready to continue. We will now review the quartile-quintile model. Pause the video and read through the bullet points on this slide. Once reviewed, resume the video. The quartile-quintile model can be a great fit for some districts and teaching categories. To use this model, the district would sort the pretest scores into quartiles or quintiles for all students in the district who took the pretest. After the post-test, the district then sorts the scores into quartiles or quintiles for all students in the district who took the post-test. Districts would then determine the average score for each quartile or quintile. Students who demonstrated at or above either the average score or the average growth for their respective quartile or quintile would have met expected growth. Note that growth targets are set after the post-test in this model, and districts should consider if they want to share growth targets with students and teachers earlier in the year for goal-setting purposes. Pause the video and read through the data on this slide. Once reviewed, resume the video. Looking at this model, we can see that the quintiles are broken down by the average scores on the pretest and post-test. With quintile 1, the average pretest score was 20 and the average post-test score was 60. The student Shannon was in the first quintile and had to score a 60% to meet his expected growth target. In contrast, when looking at Abby, she needed to score a 70 to align with the second quartile, but ended up scoring a 60. Therefore, she did not meet expected growth. In addition to using average pretest and post-test scores, districts could also utilize this model as an average percentage growth point for each quartile or quintile. For instance, students in quintile 5 on average showed 30 points of growth between assessments. For students to hit their growth target, they would need to exceed the 30 points in this variation of the quartile-quintile growth model. Looking at Asim, he started the year in the 4th quintile. The average growth for the quintile was 34 points. He made an 85 on his test and exceeded his growth target by 1 point. One question the TIA team often receives is, what about the high achieving students whose expected growth would be over 100%? It is a local decision how districts handle this calculation. Some districts have opted to follow a scenario that has all high achieving students maintain their high proficiency level. So for example, if the quartile gain of 30 percentage points would lead to an expected growth of 105%, an alternative expected growth score could be to maintain the 90% proficiency or above. Again, this is a local decision and districts have to consider all models and their flexibility in adapting to both the highest and lowest achieving students. Now that we understand how the quartile-quintile growth model works, let's look at some benefits and considerations when implementing the model to set expected growth. Pause the video and read through the bullets on this slide. Once complete, resume the video. One benefit is that it can be a good fit for when students tend to perform at varying levels across groups. For instance, a general education classroom with both high and low achieving students would be ideal for this model, as it can be applied to all student groups regardless of how they do on the pretest. One consideration for districts is that the model does not assume the same amount of growth across groups. Each group will have different goals based on their pretest and post-test scores. The model also does not provide a target at the beginning of the year for students to aim for as a goal. This can be an issue if the district is doing goal setting for students at the beginning of the year. Now that we have considered the quartile-quintile model to set expected growth, let's do a thinking exercise. Complete the following portions of the worksheet. Quartile-quintile model based on average percent of growth, and the practice setting expected growth targets worksheet located in the Google Drive folder for this presentation. Pause the video, review the activity, and resume the video when ready to continue. We will now examine other different or individualized methods for setting expected growth. The individualized growth model for setting expected growth is not to be confused with the TIA requirement of setting growth at the individual student level. Remember, growth targets are required for all students at the individual level, and any growth models presented today can accommodate that purpose. The individualized growth model is a specific model utilized in smaller classes where the teacher has a high degree of familiarity with the students. These growth targets are unique and set for individual students based on their history and available data. The individualized growth model can be a good fit for special education as they can be tied to IEP goals. To be clear, IEP goals are not the same as expected growth for student learning, but the TIA student growth targets can align to individual student learning goals. Pause the video and read the description. Once you have finished reading the description, press play to continue. Reviewing this individualized growth model example, take note that Kirby is in a small setting and the teacher has a high degree of familiarity with the student to set growth goals. Both are necessary to run the individualized growth model effectively. By the end of the year, Kirby has progressed and can recognize 20 letters. Additionally, he has moved ahead on some basic word recognition. Based on the data, Kirby has met his growth target. The individualized growth model really does lend itself well to settings where growth goals can align with individual student learning goals. Let us review the benefits and considerations when implementing the other or different individualized methods to set expected growth. Pause the video and read through the bullet points on this slide. Once complete, resume the video. Some benefits include it being a good fit for students with IEPs, as the goals can be tailored to the individual student. Some considerations with this model is the requirement for access to historical data. Without it, this model would be ineffective, making it challenging to run the model for a large group of students. It's best applied to small groups, where the teacher has a high degree of familiarity with the student. For more information on the individualized growth model, please see the Individualized Growth Model Special Education FAQ in the resources folder associated with this presentation or at tiatexas.org/resources. Next steps for districts that want to calculate growth locally should include the development of a communication plan for stakeholder engagement to determine which models may best represent particular courses. Additionally, districts need to plan for checkpoints with teachers throughout the year to determine if students are on track to meet their growth goals. Districts should also refine their data systems to ensure alignment with setting growth targets locally. This includes processes for tracking teachers throughout the year, organizing data, and securing the data. Finally, districts are encouraged to run their historical data through different models to determine which fits best in their local context. Some models will work well for some teaching categories, and while others may not. Some models also work well for smaller classes, while others help facilitate larger numbers of students. Want to practice with what you learned today? Complete the student growth sample data set activity in the Google Drive for this presentation. View these applicable resources and more when you visit us at tiatexas.org/resources. If you have any questions or need assistance in setting expected growth targets, please contact our team at tia@tea.texas.gov. Thank you for joining us.